was meant to be the perfect escape. I'd booked a remote Airbnb nestled deep in the Colorado mountains, a secluded cabin far from the noise of the city. I'd been looking forward to this weekend for months, a chance to unwind, disconnect from technology, and immerse myself in nature. The pictures online showed a cozy little cabin surrounded by towering pine trees and a stunning view of the mountains. It looked idyllic. The drive up was longer than expected, winding roads that seemed to stretch endlessly through the dense forest. As I got closer, the paved road turned to gravel, and I found myself driving deeper into isolation. No cell service, no other cars, just the silent expanse of the woods surrounding me. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the trees. The cabin was exactly as advertised, small, rustic, with a wraparound porch and large windows that offered panoramic views of the forest. There was a small fireplace inside, along with a modest kitchen and a single bedroom upstairs. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that presses in on you, making you hyper-aware of every little sound. After unpacking, I made myself a quick dinner and settled in for the night, reading a book by the fire. The cabin felt cozy, but there was an underlying tension I couldn't shake. Every so often, I thought I heard faint noises, scratches, almost like something brushing against the walls outside. I told myself it was just animals. The forest was full of wildlife, and it wasn't unusual for animals to wander close to buildings in remote areas. Still, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. Later that night, as I lay in bed, the noises continued. Soft scratching, sometimes near the window, other times from the back wall of the cabin. At one point, I swore I heard faint whispers, like someone was standing just outside the window, murmuring too quietly for me to make out the words. I got up, peered out into the darkness, but saw nothing, just the dense forest, shrouded in shadows. I tried to ignore it. After all, I had come here for peace and quiet, and I wasn't going to let my imagination ruin the experience. I forced myself to go back to sleep, though it was fitful and uneasy. The next day was brighter, and the uneasy feeling from the night before began to fade as I spent the afternoon hiking nearby trails. The forest was beautiful, serene, and during the day, the cabin seemed like a peaceful retreat. I returned later in the afternoon, tired but content, and spent the early evening reading in the living room. That's when I heard the tapping on the front door. At first, it was so soft, I almost didn't register it. Just a faint tap, tap, tap. I assumed it was the wind knocking a branch against the door, but when it persisted, I decided to check. I opened the door and peered outside. No one was there. I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the tree line. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the landscape, but the woods were empty. No animals, no people, nothing but silence. As I was about to turn back inside, something caught my eye. Sitting on the doorstep, as if left there deliberately, was a small, old-fashioned radio. It looked ancient, with a worn wooden casing and large dials that reminded me of something from the 1940s. I had no idea where it had come from. The cabin had been empty when I arrived, and there hadn't been any sign of anyone else nearby. I picked it up, feeling a strange sense of unease as I turned it over in my hands. There was no note, no explanation, just the radio. Curiosity got the better of me, and I took it inside, setting it on the coffee table. I fiddled with the knobs, trying to tune it to a station, but all I got was static. I turned the dials back and forth, but the static only grew louder, filling the cabin with its eerie, grating hum. Then, amidst the crackling noise, I heard something, a voice. At first, it was faint, barely audible. I leaned closer, my heart starting to race as I strained to hear. The voice grew louder, more distinct, and my blood ran cold as I realized what it was saying. It was my name. The voice was repeating my name, over and over again in a slow, deliberate tone. "Come outside." I froze, staring at the radio as the voice continued, growing more insistent with each repetition. I couldn't move. The room felt like it was closing in around me, the static and the voice blending together in a nightmarish cacophony. My name, over and over again, filling the room, suffocating me. I stumbled back from the radio, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to get out of there. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door, leaving everything behind. The voice was still echoing in my ears as I ran to my car, the static from the radio seeming to follow me as I threw open the car door and sped down the gravel road. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I found a small hotel and checked in for the night, my hands still shaking as I fumbled with my wallet at the front desk. I spent the night in that hotel, too afraid to go back to the cabin. The next morning, I contacted the Airbnb host and told them I had to leave early. I didn't offer an explanation. I didn't want to think about it. To this day, I don't know where that radio came from or why it was left on my doorstep. But I still hear that voice sometimes, late at night, in the back of my mind, calling my name. I've always been a night owl. Whether it's the stress from work or just my own bad habits, I find myself awake well past midnight more often than not. It's during these late night hours, standing on my balcony with a cigarette in hand, that I take in the quiet of my secluded neighborhood. The houses are spread far apart, each tucked behind tall fences, giving everyone their privacy. No barking dogs, no late night parties, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. But recently, something strange had started to bother me. It all began on a Thursday night, one of those crisp, quiet evenings when the world feels oddly still. I had stepped out onto my balcony, like I always do before bed, to smoke. As I lit my cigarette and took that first drag, something caught my eye. My neighbor, who I had never met, had a black van parked in his driveway, a van I hadn't seen before. His house was just visible over the fence, and although I didn't know much about the guy, I knew he usually drove a navy blue BMW. I had never noticed much activity around his place. He seemed to live alone, and I figured he worked long hours because his car was often gone during the day. But now, here was this van. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he had visitors. Maybe it was a rental. It was nothing to lose sleep over, so I brushed it off. The next night, though, the same van was there again, sitting in the exact same spot. The longer I stared at it, the more uneasy I felt, though I couldn't quite pinpoint why. I shook my head, told myself I was being paranoid, and headed inside. After all, it's not like I had any reason to think something was wrong. Then it became a pattern. Every night, the van was there. Every morning, it was gone. I'm not a nosy neighbor by any means, but this strange van began to nag at me. I would look for it each night, waiting to see if it would appear again, and it always did, like clockwork. For days, I played this little game of observation, trying to convince myself that it was nothing more than a harmless oddity. But everything changed one night, and I'd soon wish I had never looked over that fence at all. It was around 2 a.m., and I was finishing my last cigarette before bed. The neighborhood was as quiet as ever, except for a faint rustling from next door. Instinctively, I glanced over the fence. That's when I saw him for the first time. My neighbor was outside, and he wasn't alone. He was dragging something, a large, heavy-looking black bag, toward the van. The way he handled it, with slow, deliberate movements, made it seem like he was struggling under its weight. I froze, watching as he slid open the van's side door and hoisted the bag inside. His movements were quick and practiced, like this was something he'd done before. But what was in that bag? Golf clubs? Luggage? No, it was too bulky for that. Too heavy. A chill ran down my spine as a darker thought crept into my mind. What if it was something or someone else? Before I could make sense of it, he climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove off into the night. The van's taillights disappeared down the road, leaving me standing on my balcony, cigarette burning down to the filter in my shaking hand. That's when I realized I had been watching him, and I think he knew. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. The van wasn't in the driveway anymore, and there was no sign of my neighbor, but I couldn't forget what I had seen. I couldn't forget the way he handled that bag, the way he looked over his shoulder before driving off. I tried to go about my day, but my mind kept returning to that van, to that bag. What was he doing? Was I just being paranoid, or was something far worse going on next door? That night, the van returned, and I was ready.